Hi there, and welcome to this lockdown lecture with myself, Rose Davey. I'm an artist and writer, and I'd like to show you 5 paintings that have really helped me in terms of inspiring my art practice, which is generally a painting practice. And these 5 paintings are Paolo Uccello's George and the Dragon, and I want to talk about this in terms of shape. Also an anonymous painting, the Chumny Ladies in Tate Britain, and I want to talk about that in terms of repetition. A painting by Domenichino in the Wallace collection. I want to talk about that in relation to colour. St. Francis in Meditation by Zurbaran, talking about this in terms of composition. And finally, Pegwell Bay by William Dyce, and I want to talk about this in terms of time. And the useful kind of thing about the format of Zoom is that we can look in real detail at these paintings. So I really want to look at these together and just go through them one by one, taking a closer look at why I think these works are pieces of supreme quality, not so much down to their symbolic value, although there is lots of symbolic meaning in each of them, but really how the artist has organized the formal elements, so color, shape, light, space within the frame. So without further ado, I shall kick off with our first one. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. So here we have Paolo Uccello's St. George and the Dragon. It's quite a late painting, painted in 1470. It's one of the National Gallery's early examples of a piece on canvas and was probably made for a bedroom. So the story of George and the Dragon dates back to the 11th century, and a village was under siege by a dragon, and the village would offer the dragon livestock to kind of keep it at bay. When they ran out of animals, they started offering up people. And a rather populous princess was offered up to this dragon. And St. George ended up going to rescue her. And this is the moment that we see here. Although what always kind of gets me is the fact that the princess seems pretty in control. She seems to have made the dragon her pet, and she actually has it on a leash even. But, you know, St. George comes in with, well, his horse is very enthusiastic. He doesn't seem that enthusiastic. But if we take a closer look at the princess, we can start to see how into shape Uccello is. If we just look at those pointy red shoes, if we look at the shapes that her fingers make, her right hand is almost like 2 legs kind of running along, and her left hand kind of almost held out a little bit, exasperated by the fact that her dragon's just been had a lance in the eye. Her neck is so long and beautiful, and it creates, the back of it creates this beautiful V shape against the darkness that's inside the cave. And you can just see a little spout of water that is hitting other water inside the cave. And her hair is scraped back from her high forehead into this incredibly pointy hairstyle. Her pointy crown, her delicate features, the points on her nose, on her chin, and working her way all the way down to her beautiful kind of clothes that she lifts up to reveal. The underside of her garment is green, the same green as the dragon, complemented by this fantastic pink. And then if we move across to look a bit closer at the dragon, the teeth are just brilliant. It's a kind of combination of human teeth, very flat kind of molars, and then these really sharp canines, and that pointed tongue that's kind of lolling out, and this moustache, which seems to be just below the nose. And then the blood that has started to drip down as a result of the lance that has gone through the other eye that we can't see. And that blood has a thickness. It's like the kind of blood you see in kind of, you know, Western movies from the 1940s, where it's like tomato ketchup blood. And it's so bright and very different from any other red that we see in the painting. Also, the shape of the tail, that kind of corkscrew as it twists off. And the wings of the dragon that have these fantastic circles that kind of look like vinyls, that we see on the top side. On the right hand side is this light pink with the blue, and then on the underside of the other wing, it's, you assume the same blue, but it looks lighter because it's now got this dark kind of pink around it, which then matches the dress of the princess. So, you know, all these things are kind of working together. And if we go to the other side, we see the horse. And this is so much fun to draw. I mean, just the curve of the neck of the horse, and then it kind of curves over and then flicks out in the tail. And you just see ellipse after ellipse, circle, 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 on the reins of the horse, and then working up into the knight's armor. And his arm, his right arm, is actually at quite a strange angle, but an angle that is necessary in order to show the kind of ellipses on his armor. And it's just such a pleasure to see all of these shapes interlocking and working together. The circles at the knee of the knight and up into the saddle as well. And this very kind of compact and muscular animal. And it would seem actually that the dragon and the horse are kind of much more engaged with what's going on. Well, I guess the dragon has to be, since it's just had a lance through the eye. But the princess and St. George almost seem quite kind of sleepy, quite nonchalant. George himself is actually quite heavy-lidded. It looks like he's falling asleep as he's plunging this lance into the dragon. So it's this kind of beautiful energy of, it's quite kind of, you know, in terms of what's actually going on, it's quite calm and sedate. And Uccello painted an earlier version of the same subject. So this is from 1430. And it's great when you can compare works by the same artist of the same subject matter, and especially when there's been a kind of a lapse of time and you can see the progression and why one is more successful than the other. Very much in terms of, you know, formal elements coming together. So if you just talk about the cave in this one, you know, it's kind of been pulled off to the right. It's just like plonked there, like someone's just set up some kind of tent-like cave. And then we have the four figures of the princess, dragon, horse, and knight, all in kind of tableau at the front. Whereas if we look at the later version, you know, Uccello's actually kind of turned these figures in. So the princess is still kind of in profile as the earlier version, is probably the most similar in terms of the figures. The dragon still has the corkscrew tail, the circles on the wings, and apparently no arms. And again, these kind of really odd teeth. But the dragon and the horse, and therefore St. George, have kind of been turned inwards. And also the cave, which I think is so key, is over to the side. So it's not kind of floating in this really kind of odd manner. And also Uccello's handling of light and dark is so much more successful, so that there is much more depth within the painting, and also the ability for figures to stand out. So, you know, as mentioned earlier, this beautiful kind of white in profile statuesque head of the princess against the darkness inside the cave. And then we have the lightness of the horse on the right-hand side, in opposition to that. Again, it's quite a similar shape of the inside of the cave. So Uccello is just actually starting to bring all these elements together in a much more kind of sophisticated way, where all spaces kind of work with each other, and color kind of connects things across. As mentioned earlier, the what the princess is wearing, the patterns within the dragon's wings, and even like the blood of the dragon relates up to the red that we see in the horse, and the purpleness of the cave relates to the kind of swirl of cloud that we see above St. George. And Uccello also has this habit of painting things that are incredibly detailed. So we see the grass is like these tiny little balls, and we even see arrangements of donut-like shapes of grass in that lower patch that are seemingly being cut out. But then the ground where we see these chevron shapes is very abbreviated, very straightforward in its description. You know, it's nowhere near as detailed as the grass. And it's nice there just to see the hoof of the horse and the claw of the dragon. And Uccello's habit of cutting out pieces of grass is also seen in this painting, which is often hung next to St. George and the Dragon in the National Gallery. And this is the Battle of San Romano, which is another masterpiece. And you can see the white charger in the center there is on this little patch of grass, which has been cut out especially for the horse. Also, going back to shape, we see here the circles in the night, also the flick of the tail, and then the kind of round shapes of the trees, which seem to just merge into clouds, which then becomes a swirl, which we see that shape kind of seen repeated in the crescent moon. And this painting actually used to hang in a library where I had to practice my violin when I was at primary school. And I was kind of baffled by this shape that is created by the swirling eye, because I was just convinced it was the kind of shape of like a lizard. When you see it in full, I just was thinking, why is this lizard coming in on the right-hand side? But this is the brilliance of these paintings, because every time I saw it, every week when I'd have my violin lesson, I was never satisfied with an answer. I just couldn't quite understand why it looked this way. And it wasn't that it was wrong, it was just odd, it was strange. And those kind of things keep you coming back again and again. And Uccello uses shape in a way that is for the complete benefit of the rest of the painting, and in a very kind of sophisticated and subtle way. So if we just look at on the ground, just by the just this shape here, it's kind of like a backwards C, and it's so vital that we have that light area. If that was all kind of cut in, this whole part of the painting would just become too dark. You kind of need it there, so that you are then led through into this landscape, which is sandwiched between the parallel line created by the lance and by the wing. And also just a note on colour, it's really kind of a battle between red and green. Those complementary colours kind of repeat all over the place, with the redness, the pinkness of the cave, the pinkness in the swirl of the storm, and obviously in the harness, the red harness of the horse, the blood, the dress, the shoes of the virgin. So the virgin, the shoes of the princess. But also this, the yellow is so important. It's there kind of subtle, in a subtle way, the lance, these decorations on the rein, and also the princess's hair. And it does just enough to balance the spectrum against this incredible turquoise blue we have as well. So within all great works, the spectrum is there, black, white, red, yellow, blue, but it's kind of muted, but organized in such a way that it benefits the entire composition. And when we break this painting down, often in the National Gallery say to students, okay, so if you look at this painting, what's different in like quite straightforward terms, what's different between the right side and the left side? And it's not immediately obvious, but in my mind, it's just right side is all spiky, 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 so many points from the teeth to the claws, to the cave points, to the wings, to the hair of the princess, the crown, her shoes. And then you move across to the other side and you just have this series of circles from the neck to the tail of the horse, the armor, the trees, the swirling eye of the cloud, and also the crescent moon. So it is a painting that is an encyclopedia of shape. And Uccello is so much an artist who's clearly aroused by shape, and organizing it in such a way that it just all works together, and the spaces between each shape create all these negative spaces, which are as important as the positive shapes that we see. And it makes one wonder, if Uccello was painting in the early 20th century, the kind of paintings he may have made. But anyway, let's move on. And we're going to move to the Chumny Ladies, which is in the Tate Britain in London. And this painting was painting in 1600 in England, but not sure who painted it. So it's assigned to nobody. But what we see two women cradling their babies in bed, and there is a there is an inscription down on the left-hand side, and I think it was originally a piece of paper on the back, and it was later written on to the front of the painting. And it says, "Two ladies of the Chumley family who were born the same day, married the same day, and brought to bed the same day." Brought to bed, meaning that they gave birth. And so we can assume that they are somehow related, but people have wondered if they're twin sisters, or perhaps they married into the family. So they married two brothers and kind of sisters-in-law, but they, just by coincidence, they happened to be born on the same day. And this painting almost acts as like a certificate, as a kind of a way to mark this unusual event within this particular family, within this community. It's based up in Cheshire in the north of England. And that's often how kind of English portraiture would operate. It would kind of explain family ties, family connections, the status of the family in quite a formal, straightforward way in a sense. And this is Barbara Gamage with 6 Children by Marcus Garretts, who's a Flemish artist who worked at the Tudor court. And this is from 1596. And you can see her with her children, her son, who she has her arm on with the sword, and he is wearing kind of traditional dress for boys. I think they kind of wear breeches after the age of 6. And also here, this is a painting from a little later, from 1636, by David de Grange, the Sultan Store family. This is quite an interesting painting, because what we actually see, we see the man in the center, and the woman lying in the bed is actually a posthumous portrait of his dead wife, who died after they had had 2 children. And you can see he holds his son's hand, again in this traditional dress for boys, who then has the wrist of his sister. But we also see his second wife with one of their sons. So in a kind of odd way, you know, it's an impossible portrait, because these 2 women are brought together, you know, in one scheme, when presumably they would never have met, and obviously they wouldn't, she wouldn't have had a child when he was married to his previous wife. But in a sense, it's like a family tree, and it's just kind of explaining the family connections. And it's unusual that there would be much kind of psychological, there would be a psychological portrayal of figures, because there's no emotion between the figures. There's no real connection apart from the holding of hands. And in the same way, the Chumny Ladies is very straightforward. It's kind of, the figures themselves almost appear as heraldry. They kind of appear a symbol. And, you know, English painting was also influenced by tomb sculpture. And this is Mary, Queen of Scots' tomb, who was buried in 1612. And here she is wearing an incredibly elaborate dress, just as the women are in the Chumley Ladies. And their children are in christening robes. And it was tradition that you would wear your wedding dress either on the christening, on the day of the christening of your child, or you would wear it on each anniversary of your wedding until it no longer fit, which I think maybe a tradition we should bring back, or not. It's like, imagine the anxiety each year. Will I get into my wedding dress this year? No, probably not. Who cares? And so this kind of straightforward manner of painting is almost leaves it perhaps to be a bit cool. It has a coolness to it. You know, it's quite a detached painting. There isn't a huge psychological element, but what it does give you is a great game of spot the difference, and it's a great painting to bring children in front of. So if we just take a quick look at each of the children that you see, you can start to see like a few differences, often in color. This one is in yellow. The lace is a slightly different design. The red is not as finished as their counterpart. You can see also the kind of dress, the sleeve is a slightly different design as well. And you see this lace detail here, and it's different here, which carries on into the collars as well. And you can see the necklace and even the kind of gauze around the neck and this bird cage detail is different to the woman sat by her side. So I love the fact that the artist has made these subtle differences. On the face of it, they look very similar, but there are differences there. And one child has blue eyes, the other has brown, and these correspond to the eyes of their mothers. It's also great that the artist has actually given one of the women slightly more of a kind of messy hairstyle. She's got this, the woman on the left has got more stray hairs than the woman on the right. And also, if you look at the expressions, again, they kind of look identical on the face of it. But when you look a little more carefully, a little bit more intensely, you start to see that there are subtle shifts. And perhaps subtle shifts that reveal a greater vulnerability for the woman on the right. And it's these shifts that are just, very kind of subtle movements or changes in our expression. So I think so much is communicated, from the mouth. They're both kind of quite tensed mouths, but perhaps the one on the left is a little more self-assured. Her eyes are a little more kind of heavy, her lids, conveying someone who is perhaps more confident, more relaxed, whereas the one on the right, eyes a little more alert, perhaps lips a bit more kind of pressed tightly together, a bit more tense, a bit more of a kind of pale complexion. She also doesn't have any eyelashes on the bottom of her eyes, unlike the woman on the left, which also kind of gives her perhaps sense of being a bit more exposed. And what it really made me think is that it was a very kind of contemporary portrayal of motherhood or child rearing, this forced comparison that often happens between parents with their children. You've had the same experience in the sense that you've both had a child at the same time, but that experience would be very different. I imagine you'd feel very differently about it as well. So in that sense, it does feel quite contemporary and indicative of child rearing. Just a note on the flatness of this image as well. It's seemingly bird's eye view and straight on at the same time. And there's no real kind of effort to try and give it any depth. And it makes one wonder what other works this artist made, perhaps more of a sign writer. Who knows? It's just quite straightforward manner. But this is the beauty of this work. And the other very important element of it is repetition. The fact that we have not one, but two figures that are the same, and the power of repetition. I don't know if anyone saw the Bridget Riley documentary that was broadcast recently. And in it, she talks about repetition, and she describes repetition as an amplifier, which I think is so key, because just a single figure, perhaps not so interesting. Two, there then becomes this connection. The idea that may have been explored in the first, then it's not that it's doubled, it just changes, it becomes different. And this idea of comparison or multiple made me think of Andy Warhol and his work Marilyn from 1962. And what happens to an image when you repeat it, you repeat it, you repeat it. And Warhol was so aware of the power of repetition. And he was obviously talking about mass manufacturing, mass media, someone becoming a commodity. But I think there are elements of that within this painting. And it's even more apparent because of these subtleties in the expressions, just they are slightly different. They're not the same person. They are two different women of two different identities and two different experiences. And the babies are kind of more straightforward, but it's the women kind of hold the key to the humanity that I think is really present within this work. So well worth a look if you're in the Tate Britain. But moving swiftly on, and we now find ourselves in the Wallace collection. And this is Domenichino's A Sibyl from the 1620s. And it's a fairly small painting, almost square-ish painting, 77 by 68 centimeters. And a Sibyl comes from the ancient Greek word for prophetess, and it was a popular subject in the early 17th century, and it was a legitimate excuse for artists to paint beautiful women. I mean, not that they really needed one, but hey, it made it appear of more of a kind of high art academic subject. And Domenichino painted at least 3 versions of this subject matter. This one was earlier one to the Wallace collection, 1616 to 17. And you can see this one is really quite similar to the Wallace collection, painted in 1622. But I don't know about you, but I feel the one in the Wallace collection is so much better. It's miles ahead of the other 2. And as I mentioned earlier, it's great when you've got the opportunity to compare works by the same artist of the same subject matter to try and understand why one might be kind of more successful than another. I think if we go to this work, there is something perhaps more sentimental. You know, there's not so much psychology there. The space above is not used to great effect. You know, the framing is not as tight. There's more kind of paraphernalia with the instrument and the musical scroll and the book. So we're kind of distracted by all these elements that don't necessarily all kind of work together. And really we're just drawn in by the kind of beauty of the woman and of her clothing. Similarly in this one, again, the hands are engaged with these texts, and the space above, it's not particularly intriguing or alluring, although her bust is kind of definitely alluring, more so than the Wallace collection, which is a bit more shaded. But these are just not as dynamic, and there's just not so much that engages the eye, that keeps us. And sometimes it's quite hard to put into words why one painting isn't so good as another. Often it comes down to, I just don't like it as much. You know, I'm not sure, but I guess I'm trying to unpick why that might be. Just the way that Domenichino in this painting describes light, it seems much more kind of blank on her face. There's not so much subtlety of shadow. And it's, especially in this one, it's a much tighter kind of brushstroke than the one in the Wallace collection, because you see how she really leans kind of in the shape of her neck and this space, which is so charged, so important. You know, the quality of an artist, their ability is all in their ability to kind of use space. So how they have created the distance between forms, how they have charged a space. You know, it's just blankness, it's nothingness. But in order to get that to really work for you, to really do something, is a real skill. And the separation of color within this work, you know, we've got the primaries, we have yellow, blue, red, and this kind of little green kind of jewel here, or some kind of decoration. So we've got the spectrum, because we then have white and then dark. So it's beautifully conceived and brought together. And the hands as well, just that light touch, and the psychology, that space which is charged with her thought. So she's a beautiful woman, but she is a woman of thought and thinking and presence. So it got me thinking, how did Domenichino manage to pull this one out of the bag when his other versions were seemingly nowhere near as successful or sophisticated? And so you may be aware that there has been that a lot has been said recently about a certain Artemisia Gentileschi, who had a fabulous show at the National Gallery, which fortunately got interrupted a few times by the pandemic. But hey, and the Artemisia's work has been rediscovered in a way that is completely overdue, but fantastic that she's finally kind of having her moment, or that she's not even a moment, that she's settling in to being an incredibly important part of European painting in terms of its history. So I was like, could the hand of Artemisia be within this work? So I know that lots of works potentially misattributed to other artists when they may well have been by her. And Domenichino is working in Artemisia at the same time in Rome, and then later in Naples as well. So it seemed to me like too much of a coincidence. And also just comparing this to some of Artemisia's work in terms of how she separates the primaries in that way. So here, you know, yellow, blue, red fanning out from the head of Holofernes. And you have this white, you know, she often puts kind of white sheets of white fabric, white dress at the bottom, and then this darkness behind, strong, strong light, influenced by the work of Caravaggio, and these women that are very physical and strong and present. And it really kind of started to make me think about how Domenichino in this work has separated the color. Also, the earring really struck a chord when I was like, I've seen that earring before, and I've seen it in an Artemisia painting in Burghley House. This is Susanna and the Elders from 1622. And even the way that she's looking up, her neck, there's some real similarities with this painting. The lips, the eyes, and also the way that she paints these beautiful white blouses and the sleeves particularly, which in Artemisia's paintings always kind of come out from underneath a top layer of fabric and revealed before the hands. And the looseness of the brushwork, you can see it here on the way that she describes this blouse as it kind of zigzags its way as it's gathered at the top, and that's subtle kind of shading at the breast, absolutely exquisite. And this use of white really kind of reminded me of the way that Artemisia paints shirts and blouses in this painting and also others. So it got me thinking, could Artemisia actually be the author of this painting? So I decided to get in touch with the Wallace collection and find out the provenance of this work. So obviously provenance of paintings can be a little murky. And they kindly got back to me and also suggested that I get in touch with the Royal Collection, Drawings Collection, or the Royal Collection in their drawing department. And when I inquired, they said that they had drawings of this painting by the hand of Domenichino, and it was a provenance related directly to his studio. So there's absolutely no way that Artemisia could have painted this work. And they kindly sent me these drawings, which you can see are really quite detailed and carefully thought out preparations for the painting. You can see here the hands that are so beautifully kind of, placed over one another, and that gentle connection. Also the drawings for the head as well, and for the headscarf that we see in the final version of the painting, another study for the head. And so was I disappointed? Yes, I was disappointed. But then I thought, well, that doesn't mean that Artemisia didn't have any hand. Like, as any artist knows, it might even be when you go to art school and you find yourself in the studio of another, and maybe you're working on a similar subject matter, similar style, you're trying to solve similar problems, and you see someone else do it really well and you think, I know what to do. I'm going to do a bit of that. I'm going to use what they're doing and place it into my own work. Same with musicians. If you play with other musicians, they can really bring you up. So perhaps, Domenichino saw what Artemisia was up to in her studio, saw how she was applying paint, saw how she was organizing color within the frame and separating the primaries in that way. And it enabled him to make this work of supreme quality. And when you see it in the Wallace collection, it really is iconic, and it really does stand out on the wall. But who knows? Well done, Domenichino, and sorry for thinking it was by Artemisia, but I bet she had something to do with it. Anyway, back to the National Gallery. And this is Francisco Zurbaran's St. Francis in Meditation. This is another work that I used to see when I was a child, and I would just be fascinated when in front of it. Can I see the eyes under the hood? Can I not? And it would change depending on the kind of light within the National Gallery on that given day, if you could or you couldn't see them. Actually, from this image, I think you pretty much can, just as the nose, the kind of triangle of light, or the nose protrudes from the shadow, and the lips, is it an intake or a kind of a sigh, an exhale? There is a painting of kind of sound, as well as supreme kind of stillness. This is a figure who is there in body, but very much elsewhere in mind, completely unaware of us. Sometimes within paintings, you have that, sense that the painting is looking to you, that they're connecting with you. Whereas here, we are privileged to be in the presence of this incredibly spiritual and powerful moment of intense kind of, I guess, conversation with God that St. Francis is experiencing. And St. Francis was a figure who had given up all of his worldly goods, all his wealth, and had dedicated himself to a pious life, to a life of poverty. And so he was a real poster boy for the Catholic Church as a figure in light of the Counter-Reformation, when the Catholic Church were trying to really, restore people's faith and keep people faithful by not shying away from using images, but ramping it up even more and encouraging artists, or rather utilizing what artists were then able to achieve in terms of these incredible paintings of figures in this very dramatic light, with a real sense of realism, and a sense that these figures were actually there in front of them. Think of the power of seeing a painting like this back in the 17th century, feeling like this figure is in front of you. You could touch the kind of the threads of his frayed elbow. And we see St. Francis deep in prayer, deep in meditation, with the skull pressed to his chest. It kind of has this yellowy, cool texture that you can really feel, and the kind of collision of light and dark shapes that are his hands clasped together. And also you can just see the signs of stigmata here. And as I said, he has this patched elbow that has a hole in it, that's frayed, and also this patched here. But those light patches are so important, vital to the success of this work, because they receive the light. These light shapes that exist here and here, they receive the light in a very different way. If this had all been, the same color, if this had all been this kind of heavy brown material. And this is a masterclass in how to place a figure within the frame. We have the L shape of St. Francis. And again, talking about spaces and how they can be charged. This is just the right distance. This is just the right distance here, just the right distance here. And that we see this kind of subtle line. And then here it's bright and stark to the point where we can see the kind of individual threads. Also, this kind of bluey shadow. It had to be blue. It had to be a bluey shadow. It couldn't have been a purpley shadow, an orangey shadow. It had to be blue to then work with the kind of brown tones of the dress. And also the rope is so important. It trails off to the right. Of course, not the left. It'd have to be the right, so that it kind of fans out at the bottom of the frame. And you can see here the shadow as well that Zurbaran so beautifully follows as it kind of trickles down, and then it finds its way and it just appears again there. Yeah, absolutely beautiful and so kind of well placed. And it is just one of those works you just stand in front of and you just have to look. It's one of those works when words don't really do it any justice. And interestingly, when it was acquired by the National Gallery in 1853, a critic for the Times remarked that it was a small, black, repulsive picture. But it's now considered one of Zurbaran's great masterpieces. And when you see it on the wall of the National Gallery, you can see that actually the works nearby, this is by Giuseppe de Ribera, they also use the frame in this way. Christ is kind of like sat almost against the physics of the frame. And also another work by Zurbaran, again of the same subject matter. So this is another St. Francis, but this St. Francis is much more kind of present. He's not so kind of in his thoughts and this spiritual communion with God. He's more grounded. His head is completely revealed, his hand, we somehow feel more connection. There's also a landscape behind and a small hut. And he dissects the frame in a diagonal manner, but it hasn't got that iconic quality of the other version. It doesn't have the same impact. The spaces within it are not so kind of charred. This large, dark area, it doesn't do as much as the areas of dark do, as these areas of dark give us in this work. So again, it's great to have the ability to compare these two paintings and to see why one may be kind of more successful than the other. And it's also, when you see this work in the National Gallery, you need the space of the gallery in order to see it, because it feels like it floats up above you, and to see it in, I think it's in room 30, and to see it in that room, which is a huge open space, it makes it the experience, it just kind of, you lift up with it and out within. So a fabulous painting that if you're in central London, in Trafalgar Square, just nip in and see it. But let's go to the seaside now. And this is Pegwell Bay by William Dyce. And well, the full title is Pegwell Bay, Kent, a recollection of October the 5th, 1858. And Pegwell Bay is just south of Ramsgate, if people know the coast of Kent well. And in the mid-19th century, it was a popular holiday destination for the middle classes. You can see here, people go on donkey rides. You could go and do some shrimp fishing. You could do some rock pooling. And we see the artist's family in the foreground, his son in the pink scarf, and his wife and her two sisters. And we see the artist himself on the far right, and he has with him artist materials. You can see here how detailed this painting is. It's a small work, it's an oil on canvas, but it's 63 by 90 centimeters, but the level of detail is astonishing. And so we see Dyce staring up into the sky, and what he is staring at is a comet. It's Donati's comet. You can see it up here. And it was the kind of greatest, at the time, the most beautiful comet in living memory. And it was the first comet to be photographed. And it was nearest to the Earth on October the 10th in 1858. So just 5 days after this recollection, after Dyce and his family are said to have visited the beach. And it is a kind of painting of deep thought and contemplation. You know, it's that moment when you just see something, and he's, you know, Dyce, who we see there, he's not telling anyone else, look at this comment, look at this comment. It's all, you know, it's towards the end of the day, there's people that are kind of going about doing these kind of activities of leisure, and he gazes up to see this kind of incredible phenomenon in the sky. And, you know, this is when science is really starting to kind of dismember religious narratives and religious thought. And this beach was also frequented by Charles Darwin and his family. And this is of the time when Darwin had published The Origin of the Species, which of course kind of blows apart the idea that the Earth was made on, I think, the 28th of October, 4004 BC in 6 days. The ideas that kind of Darwin starts to explore within his book, within his work, you know, really start to unravel, you know, these concepts of time and geology and science and astronomy. And all this knowledge is, you know, it's overwhelming, it's huge. And this is a painting that starts to encapsulate, you know, the kind of minute and the magnificent. So family going about their, you know, their leisure activities or on holiday. And then these kind of ideas of time and our existence, which is personified by the comet and also the kind of lines in the rock. But the comet doesn't overwhelm this family excursion. You know, it's just this dash of white in the sky, which is also fabulous. You know, just as a person looking at this painting, you could miss it. You could miss the comet and not see it, just like you could as a person who is on the beach, or, you know, Dyce is the only one seemingly that has actually witnessed it. Another artist, William Turner, not that one, of Oxford, painted this. It's called Donati's Comet, Oxford, 7:30 p.m., 5th of October, 1858. So I love these scientific titles. But here, you know, it's all about the comet, and it's a kind of sensational event. Whereas in Dyce's version, it's much more subtle. And that's why it's so much more kind of special, if you like. The light in this painting is just incredible. It's so yellowy, it's ominous, it's slightly eerie, it's very still, and it's in a really specific time of day. You're just kind of doing your last bits and bobs. You're about, you know, getting ready to head home. You maybe just made it down to the beach to have a quick last, you know, look at rock pools perhaps before you go home. It's that, you know, you're just using up those last few moments of the day. The donkeys, you know, done for the day. They're about to head back up. And then this incredible comet makes an appearance. And this, I think, this portrait of Dyce's son, he is in deep contemplation. He must be a boy of maybe 3 or 4 years old. And the spade, it's not being used, it's not in action. He's holding it very loosely. It's just kind of, there against his knee, and he's looking out. It's seemingly not at something happening. He's not kind of alert. He's a child in deep thought. And then if we look to the women, their faces are kind of doll-like. This woman that's bent over, her face kind of perpendicular to her body. It's that's like at a right angle, incredible. And you can see in her basket, she has these shells that she's picking up. The woman behind, the color here is just to die for. This beautiful orange in complementary to this lilac, pale lilac. You can see this heavily quilted robe. And the only figure really that is kind of has any momentum is this figure who seems to be walking with a net over his shoulder. And just the line of the net works beautifully down into the line of her. And even it kind of has this parallel relationship with this line up here. These are the kind of things that make a painting that has so much detail, so much information, but somehow Dyce manages to negotiate it, to order it, so it all works together and nothing kind of overwhelms anything else. Another figure of the woman kind of turning, again, this kind of heavy dress, these beautiful details of the kind of the cut fabric, the lines, the tassels on her shawl, and also her hat. These lines we see here relates to the rock strata behind, and the redness. I wondered if this was a shimmering fabric, but I think perhaps Dyce does it to highlight, her, to bring her forward a little more in the composition. And also you can feel this wet, soggy, but really bright green seaweed that I guess most people are familiar with, the really slippy stuff that you must be very careful of. And if we compare if we compare what the women are wearing in this painting with another painting painted around the same time. This is Arthur Boyd Horton's Ramsgate Sands from 1861. It's a very different kind of vibe, very different atmosphere, a blustery day on the beach, but a woman dressed in kind of very fashionable clothes. Her hair is beautifully done, have these flowing fabrics, and these two people seem to kind of be admiring her in quite a very close proximity, and she's seemingly ignoring her, and this kind of child down here, which is quite short legs and fabulous hat. But her in the center, it doesn't have any of the balance or sophistication in terms of order of form and light as Dyce's painting does. There's a slight charm to it, but it's a very kind of different description or experience of the beach, which the clothes that these women wear are practical. They're there to keep warm, to wrap up, and they're very much engaged within what they're doing. They're not there to be seen by anybody else or to parade in that way. And it's much more quieter, much more subtle, but just stunning. Love it. And it's all these things coming together, and also the horizontal nature of the beach, of water, of land. And then, we human beings are these vertical things that crop up. And it's that beautiful collision of those two forms of the land and of those who inhabit the land and walk around the land. And again, just seeing how things connect in, this figure here connects beautifully with this shape up on the rock. And again, thinking about Dyce and thinking about other works that he made, works of similar subject matter, but that perhaps weren't so successful. This is a painting painted around the same time in 1858, a scene in Arran, so up in Scotland now. We're in the middle of the summer, not in kind of late autumn. And again, another family outing, but it just doesn't quite have the same connection, supremely detailed Dyce painting in the tradition of the Pre-Raphaelites, but there's just not the same quality of ideas that have been able to be conveyed through the organization of light, form, color, space, Whereas this painting is full of thought and full of kind of the unknown and uncertainty, you know, that setting of the sun and those figures that are contemplating, and no one's communicating with each other either. It's a painting where everyone is kind of, they've gone into themselves, even though they're there as a family, they're together. Everyone is having these experiences on their own as an individual. And this is a kind of painting that one might overlook in the Tate Britain, partly because it's behind a massive bronze sculpture, so they really need to sort that out. But it is very small. And so if you do find yourself around the Pimlico area, just pop into the Tate Britain and go and have a look at it, because it is absolutely fabulous. So I'm hoping that it's been useful just hearing how these images have helped me as an artist. The Uccello, in terms of how he organizes shape and how he really gets things to work together. Again, just looking at that, woo, straight up into there, straight down into there, woo, 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 woo. Sorry, sound effects are sometimes useful with paintings. Looking at the Chumny Ladies and repetition, the power of repetition, and also subtle differences, how this doesn't just become a certificate of a family event, it becomes something much more that does have a psychological element that is subtle, but it's there. And it's really quite melancholic in a way. And it's very strange that these women are in bed with their babies in their like elaborate wedding dresses, but another fabulous work. And also Domenichino's iconic painting, the separation of color, working in a circle around the kind of spectrum, and just leaning away from this space, all about that space. And again, similarly with the Zurbaran, St. Francis, his knees bent and placed within this frame, where every single space charged to the edge of the frame, the rope trailing this way, his legs trailing that way, and these light patches. That was a lucky accident that he had patched these clothes so that he could receive the light in that way, and his nose and mouth just protruding out. Fabulous. And finally, Pegwell Bay, a painting all about time, all about the big questions of existence, and kind of portrayed through a family outing. So in quite a sentimental event or kind of memory. I think this painting is all about memory, but here we have the rocks that have been here for millennia, and the comet, from outside of the earth, and one person who has noticed it and what that might mean for us and our future. And I take all of these things that I recognize or see or enjoy within these paintings and try and bring them back to my own work in terms of color, in terms of shape, in terms of the frame, in terms of repetition, and in terms of time, being colors or combinations that speak to a particular time. And although I'm not a figurative painter, a lot of the paintings, actually all of the paintings I've been talking about are figurative, but for me, it's really how these artists have used color, shape, form, light within the frame. And that is why I find them so kind of inspiring and unique. So I hope that that has been of some interest. And thank you very much for watching. Bye for now.